Hello, my name is Calvin Barbie. I presented recently at the Prancing Pony Podcast Moot in 2022 at Marquette University. Because there was some issue with the recordings, unfortunately, the original recording of my presentation has gone missing and they weren't able to share it. I decided, it'd be best to just kind of, throw it together here. So there were a couple of people who came up and said they wanted to watch it, so I figured it'd be best to kind of throw it together so people who were unable to see it on that Saturday were able to get an idea of what it was like presenting there. So going forward, this is just going to be trying to get as close to that original presentation that was I gave on Saturday. The goal of this work is to take a deep analytical look into Tolkien's portrayal of loneliness and the courage needed to fight through such desperate times. This will be done by focusing on the character of Marquette, Brandybuck, and the Return of the King. Throughout The Lord of the Rings, each of the four hobbits finds themselves separated from each other. Frodo and Sam are ripped apart as they crept their way into Mordor, resulting in Samwise showing his courage as he rescues his master Frodo. Merry and Pippin are sent on separate paths as well, with Pippin being sent to Gondor alongside Gandalf, while Merry stays with the Riders of Rohan. While each hobbit shines in these moments of tribulation, I believe that a major theme is often overlooked in the process: loneliness, a pure feeling of isolation, a feeling of desperate separation, of powerlessness. I believe that this feeling is represented at best in Marquette Brandybuck's experience. Section 1. Who is Marquette Brandybuck? While I know that many, if not all of you, are all too familiar with the character of Merry, I believe that it is best to start a deeper look into his journey as a character up until the scene in question. Often considered the most poised and intelligent of the four hobbits, Merry plays a critical role throughout the journey. Early in the work, Tolkien portrays him as an experienced traveler, as a generally well-prepared hobbit. Merry plays a central role in helping Frodo in his move out of Hobbiton, and his knowledge of the land helps the hobbits to evade danger in the early steps of their journey. Later in the work, Merry pledges his loyalty to King Theoden of Rohan, who names him Esquire of Rohan. The hobbit views the king as a paternal figure, stating, "As a father you shall be to me," upon pledging his service. Merry held this feeling to be true even past the death of the king, as at his funeral Merry states, "Theoden King, farewell, as a father you were to me, for a little while, farewell." It is in his service to the king that we see his exploits on the fields of Pelennor. Despite having disobeyed a direct order from Theoden, Merry finds himself on the battlefield. It is here where he courageously defended Eowyn in her battle against the Witch King. This is also where the hobbit loses his paternal figure. On this point, Tolkien writes, "Farewell, Master Hibbitla," he said, "my body is broken, I go to my father's." Merry could not speak but weep anew. "Forgive me, Lord," he said at last. The old king smiled. "Grieve not, it is forgiven. Great heart will not be denied. Live now in blessedness, and when you sit in peace with your pipe, think of me." This is a moment of great loss for Merry. While healing from his losses in the Houses of Healing, Merry talks of this loss to Aragorn and Pippin, stating, "I shan't ever be able to smoke again without thinking of him." And that day, Pippin, when he rode up to Isengard, was so polite, to which Aragorn says, "Smoke then and think of him." Merry's journey up to this point, when the company leaves the Black Gate, shows him to be a well-prepared, courageous, and generally a character that is not afraid to jump into action, even if it puts his own life at risk. I argue that this is rather intentional, that Merry has his agency torn away from him at this exact moment in the story. Section 2. Friendless and Alone. The central theme of The Lord of the Rings is that no one need face their battles alone, though it is often, as we have seen, they do when the need arises. Tolkien scholars have viewed the interactions and relationships of the characters through the lens of the long defeat, an idea that all their actions are doing little more than prolonging an inevitable defeat. We constantly see characters working together and building relationships along the way. Even as the initial fellowship is broken, its members build new relationships and new friendships and alliances. Scholars argue that the nature of the long defeat is one of a persistent and sacrificial nature. We can see this early on through the heroic deaths of Boromir and Gandalf's battle with the Balrog. Throughout the text, we see characters courageously engage with the enemy, putting their lives on the line in an attempt to save those they love, or in its most basic nature, to do what needs to be done. Despite this view, the themes of loneliness and loss are present throughout Tolkien's works, as many of his central characters find themselves alone as they face a great foe. Sam and Shelob are a great and often cited example of this. In discussions on loneliness and courage, one scene is particularly overlooked. After Merry has begun to recover from his injuries he sustained on the battles of Pelennor Fields, he is still not strong enough to ride alongside the Fellowship and the rest of the Army of the West as they march off to the Black Gate. Merry feels a great shame in his inability to ride to battle. This is very similar to how he felt upon hearing the words of Theoden, who would not allow him to ride to Gondor with the rest of the Rohirrim. Merry says to Theoden, "All my friends have gone to battle. I should be ashamed to stay behind." Prior to the army's departure, Aragorn speaks to Merry. Aragorn assures Merry that he need not feel ashamed that he is unable to ride at the Black Gate alongside Pippin to represent the Shire folk in the forthcoming battle, as he has already done a great service and earned his honor. Aragorn's words of comfort shift back to the reality at hand, as he states that, but in truth, all now are in like danger, though it may be our part to find a bitter end before the gate of Mordor. If we do so, then you will come also to a last stand, either here or wherever the black tide overtakes you. Aragorn's words did little to raise the spirit of the hobbit as he stood despondently as he watched the army muster together. Tolkien makes mention that Merry is able to spot Pippin among the army, showing that Merry was both thinking of and carefully looking for his friend in this moment. We can see a parallel to this moment through Pippin's thoughts of Merry as he battles against the forces of Mordor at the Black Gate. "I wish Merry was here," he heard himself saying. "We might die together, Merry and I, and since die we must, why not? Well, as he is not here, I hope he'll find an easier end, but now I must do my best." Alongside Merry stood the Gondorian child Burgo, who was also in low spirits as he watched his father Beregond of the city guard, ready himself to lead a company of men to the Black Gate. We see the departure of the army through Merry's perspective as Tolkien writes, "Troop by troop and company by company they wheeled and went off eastward, and long after they had passed away out of sight down the great road to the causeway, Merry stood there. The last glint of morning sun on spear and helm twinkled and was lost, and still he remained with bowed head and heavy heart, feeling friendless and alone. Everyone that he cared for had gone into the gloom that hung over the distant eastern sky, and little hope at all was left in his heart that he would ever see any of them again." This moment of isolation and despair causes Merry's wound to ache, now that he is left friendless and alone. All his companions march off to what seems to be an unwinnable battle. He wishes for nothing more than to be riding off alongside them, and even feels a great shame in his injured state. In this moment, all Merry is left with is the faintest hope that his friends will triumph and he will see them all again. Yet in this moment of loneliness, as Merry's strength lessens, Tolkien's theme of courage shines. Merry's position in Gondor is very similar to the concept of northern courage, the creed of an unyielding will. This theory of courage is rooted in northern mythology as the chosen allies of the northern gods, when able, find similar heroic courage to resist against the monsters. While Merry is no longer in a physical battle against the forces of Mordor, he is in a mental battle. Merry's courage in this moment is similar to that of the northern courage, as a reader can interpret his hope as an unyielding will. Scholar Sass and Wayan argue that the northern courage plays an essential part of the long defeat present in Tolkien's work, forming a necessary symbiosis of eucatastrophe and decatastrophe, of continuing to fight without hope or victory or reward. Merry's fight is one rooted in waning hope. It is all he has in this moment, as he is stuck between the optimistic hope of a joyous outcome and the pessimistic dread of a further loss. Let's return a moment to the phrase friendless and alone. While the word friend or some iteration of the word is used quite frequently throughout the text, the word friendless is used only once in the whole of The Lord of the Rings. Its placement then is even more intentional given this observation. Tolkien could have simply said that Merry felt a great deal of loneliness and dread. However, the use of the word friendless amplifies Merry's feelings of loneliness. Merry has lived through several very traumatic moments, and in most of these cases we see him being able to physically respond in some manner. We can see his courage and quick thinking serve him well during the fall of Boromir, for example. Yet here we find Merry, the furthest from harm of any of the Fellowship, where we can see his courage come back into play. He is stripped of his agency as he is kept from the battle of the Black Gate, yet one can imagine that is facing his greatest mental foe since the journey began. Merry is left actionless. His wisdom cannot aid his friend, nor can his sword protect them. All he has is his thoughts and imagined outcomes of the forthcoming battle. His heart still feels the sting of the loss of Theoden as he watches his friends ride off to war. It's easy then to imagine that he too is imagining the potential loss of some, if not all, of his friends. As Merry watches his friends embark into the distant gloom, Merry too is metaphorically as well as physically covered in darkness. Merry's spirits are in such disarray that he begins to feel old and weak, as he feels the sunlight begin to thin. His wounds also start to ache, as he is consumed by his emotions. His physical pain stands as a reminder of his recent loss of King Theoden, whom he viewed as a paternal figure, while his mental fortitude dwindles as he fears of losing everyone else that he cares for. It is the child Burgo who pulls Merry from this darkness, as he takes the hobbit by the hand. Burgo assures Merry that the men of Minas Tirith will not be overcome, and now they have the Lord Elfstone and Beregond of the Guard too. Despite watching his father march off to war, it is Burgo who reminds the halfling to have courage. Perhaps one could argue that Burgo was simply displaying his childhood optimism in this moment, especially due to his direct mention of his father alongside Aragorn. However, I believe that he is instead courageously overcoming his fears of hope. While we do not see Mary's response to the child's words, the reader understands that all Mary is left with is a glimmer of hope that he will see his friends again. In what is arguably one of Mary's bleakest moments, it is the courage instilled in him from a child that pulls him from his darkness and rekindles his hope. This is the last we see of Mary for some time. The story shifts to the exploits of Aragorn's army at the Black Gate, and then back to Frodo and Sam as they destroy the ring. When we do see Mary again, we see him meeting with Faramir as the two discuss Éowyn. We do not know what Mary shares exactly, though his words allow Faramir to learn of the Shield Maiden's grief, which helps him bridge the gap between the two of them. Soon after, we see Mary leave Gondor upon hearing victory against Mordor. This is a huge catastrophic moment for Mary, as this is a sudden and almost unexpected joyous outcome. Section 3. Tolkien, the Wounded Soldier. So why does all of this matter? What was Tolkien doing when he sidelined Mary? Considering the professor's widely known disdain for allegory, I would not argue that Tolkien is purposely pulling elements of his real-world experience into a small section of The Lord of the Rings in order to make a commentary of his experience of a soldier. However, I would adapt a phrase from the professor, as I believe that we are seeing here is a reflection of true history in the feigned, a subtle, not distracting, glimpse into trauma of a wounded soldier and, in some regards, survivor's guilt. In John Garth's Tolkien and the Great War, we can see similarities between Brandybuck and Tolkien. In Garth's telling of Tolkien's return to England, we see the fever-stricken soldier comment on the state of his fellow men alongside the hospital ship the Asturis. There are those who, of course, joyful to be heading back to England with a scar in his story. Among them are also those struck with illness, both born from the trenches and the harshness of winter. But there are those who never step off the ship, as they succumb to their injuries or illness while aboard the vessel. If one were to place Mary upon the Asturis, Tolkien would have had much in common with the Hobbit. Both are in very comfortable living quarters as they recover from their illness, yet their minds are elsewhere. Both have experienced war and loss. Tolkien had lost his dear friend Robert Gilson, while Mary had lost King Theoden. After several weeks home, Tolkien was brought in front of a military medical board, and despite being in a much healthier state, was deemed unfit for service. Just as Tolkien was unfit to return to battle, so too was Mary, as even though Aragorn had healed his wounds, he was still too weak to take up arms. While recovering from the trench fever, Tolkien maintained correspondence with his close friends, G.B. Smith and Christopher Wiseman, as they continued their service in the war. During this time, they continued to exchange writings and letters. Smith sent Tolkien poems of loss and the horrors of war, while also sharing in his joy that Tolkien had returned home. In a November letter to Tolkien, Smith mentions his hope of seeing his friend again soon. It is a great unfortunate that Smith would pass from his injuries he sustained just a month later, leaving only Wiseman and Tolkien as the surviving founding members of the TCBS. I do not mean to argue that Tolkien is inserting himself into Mary in this point. Rather, I would argue that they are two soldiers who, on top of experiencing great loss during the battle, were pulled from the war before its end. Essentially, they are both sidelined from action, no longer able to impart any direct agency upon the forthcoming battles. Yet they both still hold close to hope that they will see their remaining friends again. The scholars have argued that Tolkien's personal experience and reactions to loss can be seen as real-world examples of northern courage. Writing of Tolkien's feelings following the death of his mother, Humphrey Carpenter stated that to Tolkien, nothing was safe, nothing would last, no battle would be won forever. Carpenter argues that this loss turned Tolkien into an eternal pessimist, only sharing those feelings in his writings, while externally he was rather an optimistic person. Tom Shippey also wrote of Tolkien's relationship with loss. In relationship to Tolkien the soldier, Shippey wrote, "With his best friends dead in Flanders, Tolkien had cause to hate defeatism like poison." Tolkien's battle against defeatism is exemplary of northern courage, as despite his physical battle ending, his hope for a future is unyielding. Garth also makes a point of this when discussing Tolkien's view of his son's involvement in World War II. Tolkien wears his optimism on his sleeve as he writes to his son Christopher, "Keep up your hobbitry in heart and think that all stories feel that way when you're in them. You are inside a very great story." Despite being sidelined from this war, I contend that Tolkien is also imbuing his son with courage in his battle against defeatism. Tolkien scholars such as Jane Beale have argued that Tolkien leaned into the principle of eucatastrophe when he wrote his versions of medieval legends and his legendarium. One could argue that through Mary's experience as a wounded soldier, Tolkien is transforming the experience of a real-world soldier into a eucatastrophic moment. Tolkien's experience was like that of many, one of loss and a feeling of hopelessness. Mary's is the opposite, as he is given the joyous news of victory. While he doesn't know of the status of Pip and the others in this moment, the news fully ignites the hope in his heart. The very same hope that only his courage had left flickering. This fits with Tolkien's ideal of eucatastrophe perfectly, as despite his suffering, the honorable Brandybuck is met with joy rather than further loss. In August of 1916, Tolkien wrote to Smith following the death of Gilson. In it he writes, "I am hungry and lonely, of course, but I don't feel a member of a little complete body now. I honestly feel that the TCBS has ended, but I am not at all sure that it is not an unreliable feeling that will vanish, like magic perhaps, when we come together again. Still, I feel a mere individual at present, with intense feelings more than ideas, but very powerless. Of course, the TCBS may have been all we dreamt, and its work in the end be done by 3 or 2 or 1 survivor, and the part of the others be trusted by God to that of the inspiration, which we do know we all got and get from one another. To this I now pin my hopes, and pray God that the people chosen to carry on the TCBS may be no fewer than we 3. It is in this correspondence with Smith that we get a glimpse of Tolkien's loneliness at war. He has lost a dear friend, and fears that all the TCBS will meet the same fate. But here we also catch a glimpse of Tolkien's unyielding courage. He holds close to his hopes that the TCBS will carry on. In the face of great loss and continued destruction, it takes great courage to hold hope for a eucatastrophe. One can easily imagine similar thoughts being conjured in his mind as he lay in the hospital bed far from his friends. Tolkien courageously held close to the hope that he would see his fellow TCBS members once more. Even in the aftermath of the loss of Smith, Tolkien took his courage and upheld their legacy. I believe Tolkien weaved this element of courage into Merry, as he watched his friends march towards certain death. Just as Tolkien held close to hope, so too did Merry. Despite their losses and their feelings of powerlessness, the 2 wounded soldiers fought against defeatism courageously, as they hoped for a better future. It takes courage to take up arms against a great foe. It takes courage to put one's life on the line for another. It takes courage to move forward from loss, especially when one's hopeful outlook starts to wane. Yet it is our courage that reignites such hopeful thoughts for the future, and it is that which saves us from being consumed by the fears birthed in their absence. It is courageous to unyieldingly hope, especially in times when we are left powerless, friendless, and alone. All of these acts are courageous, and all of them represent the courage of a Brandybuck. Thank you.